Good afternoon, or for some of you, good evening, depending on where you're calling from. Welcome to a discussion regarding climate change and the people factor. My name is Zoe Thompson. I am a partner with KPMG US based in Houston, Texas. I am part of KPMG's ESG IMPACT team. I also sit within our transformation delivery practice, which, as we will discuss shortly, is relevant because for many, if not everybody, addressing climate change will indeed be a transformation in how we work. I am thrilled to be joined today by my colleague, Mike Hayes, who is the Global Head of Climate Change and Decarbonization, also the Global Head of Renewables, and also with KPMG IMPACT. Welcome, Mike. Good to see you again.
Thanks, Zoe. Delighted to be here and looking forward to a very interesting and hopefully provocative discussion.
Hopefully so, hopefully so. So let's start with the report. It is quite thorough. I believe it is 44 pages long. Lots of interesting stuff in there and a lot of good insight, perspectives. But before we touch on that, could you give us some context? Why did KPMG and Evershed Sutherland even commission this survey?
Sure. I've been involved in the climate arena generally for about the past 10 years. And I can tell you for the first 7 or 8 years, we weren't doing a lot. It was mostly talking. We've now entered an era where climate is front and center. And frankly, it's becoming a mainstream business issue. And I'm involved in various discussions and initiatives on climate. And all of those initiatives focus on a couple of very specific areas. So it focuses on the policy and the regulatory space. It focuses on capital, mobilizing capital to do things on climate. And the third area of focus is the area of innovation and technology. And they're all really, really important areas and lots of work going on. But as I continue to look at what was going on across the globe, and in particular with leading global corporations, I said those 3 areas are not enough. You know, it's one thing to have a great policy. It's a great thing to have the capital available, and the technology. But you're going to need people to implement what is, in effect, a new industrial revolution. This migration to a low carbon economy is going to be quite dramatic. And I emphasize it's going to be quicker than people realize. We're not going to be able to achieve this without understanding the role that people and human capital will play in making this change happen. And that really was the genesis of the report. We said, let's find out how global organizations are thinking about this particular part of the agenda and how does it fit in with their wider climate ambitions.
Yeah, that makes sense. And what's interesting, and you touched on this a little bit, and I think anybody who's involved in any sort of ESG conversation knows there are a variety of stakeholders in this conversation. There are corporate investors, there are boards of directors, there are customers, there are employees. And at least what I've seen with some of the broader ESG conversations is companies can have a wide range of reasons for having this conversation. Some are saying, just keep me off the regulator's naughty list. And then some are saying, you know what, this actually, I want to change how my customers talk about me and believe what I'm actually doing. So what are you finding? Are people starting in the same spot, or are you finding that organizations have different reasons for doing it and different, therefore, strategies?
Well, I actually think ultimately we're all headed in the one direction, but think of it as a race. Some are at the front, some are in the middle, and some are at the back. And here's the reality, Zoe. I always point to 5 different pressure groups. Investors, number one. Investors are very much driving the agenda, particularly in some countries, and this is not harmonized globally. Regulators, and regulation is playing an increasingly important part. Customers, supply chain, and employees, though, are the other 3 groups. And the employee question is really important. We are increasingly seeing existing employees and potential new employees asking questions of the organizations they're going to work with. What is the purpose of this organization? What role is it playing across the wider ESG agenda? How is it tackling its climate ambition? And frankly, for organizations of the future who are going to need talent, you have to think about this through an employee lens as well. The customer and the supply chain lens, very, very important also. The reality is, if your suppliers and your customers are very much ahead on this agenda, you are going to be forced to come along. You need to respond to your customers' needs, particularly customers who are demanding greener products and services. And then from the supply chain, and particularly because of the Scope 3 issue, if you're in somebody's supply chain, they are going to put pressure on you to actually decarbonize. So what's actually happening, so is there's all of these different forces coming together to actually drive the agenda. And for me, it's not a question of who's ahead and who's behind. My message to corporations is you need to be in this race. You need to be able to say to all of those stakeholders that you're somewhere on this journey, because if you don't, you will get left behind. And we've seen a little bit of that to date, but I think that's one of the biggest risks that I see over coming years as customer sentiment shifts, as employee sentiment shifts. And bear in mind, across all of this for organizations who are listening in today, peer pressure. Look at what your peers and your competitors are doing. If you're not in the same place, you're going to find yourself in trouble.
Yeah, it's really interesting because we are finding the level of sophistication of what the general public knows and expects has changed dramatically. That they really, across the board with ESG, that consumers expect businesses to be a force for good. It's not just a place to consume. It's actually, I want the places where I give my money and I give my time actually align with my values, and it's something I care about. I mean, would you agree with that? The level of expectation as well as the level of cynicism, I think, have both changed, and people just expect more and they want to know there's actually something to it.
Correct. I think the world has changed. I think purpose, and I think corporations that think deeply about their employees, their communities, their place in the world, those are the corporations of the future. But this is going to be a bumpy ride. We need to figure out how to equate financial performance with what I would call purpose-led performance. In other words, it shouldn't be a case of either or. It should be a case that the companies who are performing well on the purpose agenda should also be the companies that will benefit financially. And that's actually the gap, Zoe, where regulation is going to play a role. We are seeing increasing imposition of carbon taxes on certain types of industries. We've seen new tax measures in Europe, this infamous carbon border adjustment mechanism. All of this is about one thing. It's about leveling up the playing field. And a message I give to corporations, there are people working in NGOs and government offices and public sectors today. They are thinking about new ways of influencing the agenda to actually force companies on this agenda if they haven't voluntarily decided to go at this point themselves.
Yeah, you touch on the financial. Another way, the pithy way of saying it is it possible to do well by doing good? And of course, those of us who are involved in climate go, yeah, absolutely. Of course it is. You just got to figure out how, which leads to a big part of what I read in the report, which is, are companies ready? And what was interesting is a lot of the questions focused around organizations' perception. So their self-perception of whether they are ready, which of course is not the same as actually being ready. So the questions talked about, do you have a climate expert involved? Okay, awesome. But do you actually have a decarbonization strategy? No, you probably don't. So that's a good indication maybe things aren't matching up. But what are some of the other things that you're seeing? What are good indicators that a company has thought this through and they're actually not just thinking they're ready, which could be delusional, but they're actually ready? Is it about the experts? Is it about their incentives? Is it about their performance management? What are you seeing that's actually working and makes you feel comfortable that a company has thought this through?
So can I go back to the first part of what you just said there about, are companies really ready? And this, for me, was one of the most dramatic things that came out of the report. As I read the responses, the perception and the responses coming from corporations was, yes, we are ready. We think we've got the skills and expertise. I have to say, even though I'm an author of the report,
the vast majority said yes. They were like, yeah, we're good. We're cool. We are totally ready.
And this is an unusual thing to say, but as the author of the report, I actually disagreed with that, with our own conclusions. I had to respect the data, but, I think that represented undue optimism. It represented ambition more than reality, as far as I'm concerned. That's not to say that there are companies who have really thought deeply about this, but in the main, I think what we've seen, Zoe, over the past 18 months is we've seen the era of making commitments. And frankly, that's great. And I applaud the commitments that have been made. I think it's a really important step. However, that's the easy part. It's when you wake up the following day and you say, I've made a net zero commitment. What do I do now? What are the solutions? What are the actions I've got to take? And the message here is very simple. This is far from straightforward. This is not a case that we can pull down a couple of standard products and say, procure a bit of renewable energy, buy some carbon offsets and you're okay. They are some of the solutions, but this ultimately involves changing the way corporations do business. And for the corporations to do that, their people need to be ready. And that is my single biggest concern about what's happening across corporate decarbonization. We are ambitious. We have set the targets. Our stakeholders have said, yes, we like it. In 12 months' time, those same stakeholders are going to say, what have you done in the 12 months since you made that commitment? They'll probably be easy enough the first year. Think it forward 2 years and 3 years. Corporations are going to come under huge pressure to deliver on these targets. And again, you go back to your very opening question, why did we think about people? Because people and people with the skills and expertise are going to be an incredibly important ingredient in making this happen. And my concern, Zoe, is that companies will say, oh yeah, it's there, but in reality, I think it's not. Maybe, and that's a long way of answering the first part of your question. You then asked, and in fact, I think what you're asking, what does good look like? And good, we'll have a much better picture of what good looks like after the event, and particularly after the first year following a commitment. But you specifically asked the question about a climate expert. There's a difference between a board appointing somebody to their board to be the climate expert and appointing a climate expert. Because quite often what we found is that companies were appointing people without the expertise, without the qualifications and the skills to take on the mantle of climate. And that's fine, that's positive, but that's a half-hearted measure in my opinion. Really what we're looking for companies to do is bring real expertise on the board. And we are seeing that CEOs, CFOs, chief operating officers, they are listening. They're listening for the reasons I alluded to earlier, because all their key stakeholders are asking very, very hard questions. But it is a real sign that a company is taking this seriously when they have put real expertise on the board. But it's not just that. It's when I see corporations starting to embed this agenda across their different units, all the way from accounting and treasury to the operation, the manufacturing and distribution bits. This is an organization-wide transformation, and we'll have to see just how far corporations are going to go. And bear in mind, all the solutions aren't there. We're going to have to focus a lot on the innovation agenda in coming years, particularly in the hard-to-abate industries. I look at things like chemicals, steel, petrochemicals, transportation. We have got some very serious challenges ahead. Irrespective of the number of people we have, we still need to keep developing technology solutions.
Yeah, it's interesting, as you touched on, there's a great expression, the walls are high and the emperor is far away. And whenever I've seen transformations that actually work, back to how is this actually embedded in the organization? If I'm working in a company that has a heavy operations focus, for example, if I go talk to somebody on the shop floor, if I go talk to somebody at the wellhead, do they know exactly what those metrics are? And do they know how their job directly contributes to those? And when I've seen successful transformations, the answer is yes. If it's the safety agenda, if it's the digital revolution, if there's something that feels huge, enterprise-wide, even societal-wide, but I can bring it down to the individual behaviors, then I think I have a fighting chance of making it work. It's when it only stays at the high level and doesn't actually get embedded that there's probably going to be a disconnect. Are you seeing that with climate as well?
I couldn't agree more. But that's the shift that's starting to happen. Climate, you sit with a bunch of folks that call themselves the sustainability advisors or whatever, in an organization. When I see organizations taking this agenda seriously, it's when I see the climate and the wider ESG agenda being adopted throughout the organization. That's not an easy thing, because again, I come back to who's going to actually make this happen in an organization. Do you have the people? It's not good enough that the CEO is on top of this agenda and is excited about it. You need the line managers, you need the people who are in charge of the manufacturing, the distribution, the marketing to live this agenda. And that's, for me, so that's the real challenge. And I very deliberately use the word mainstream. This is no longer a side issue, kind of a nice to have at a corporate level. Because of the huge pressures corporates are under, they do need to embrace this, and they do need to think about how do they build up the skills and expertise. And ultimately, some of this is going to involve very significant reskilling, retraining of existing employees.
All right, so Mike, I definitely want to talk about the reskilling, because that is quite a bit in the report. But something else that you touched on that seems really significant is the importance of collaboration and integration. And given that most organizations are not very good at either of those on the best of days, and this isn't the best of days, a lot of companies hardly collaborate within their own departments. much less across every different stop on the value chain. So what are your thoughts there? I mean, if no one company can do this by themselves, how do we promote better integration collaborations that we have the entire industry or society as a whole actually addressing this problem?
So I'm obviously much more optimistic than you, Zoe. I actually see a lot of collaboration happening. And I am, as you know, I'm incredibly passionate about this agenda. And yes, we are facing, a monumental challenge to solve it. But actually, particularly over the last 2 years, and particularly as a result and during the COVID pandemic, a great recognition that we cannot solve this on our own. So I'm seeing this within organizations where people are starting to collaborate. I'm seeing, even in our own business with accounting firms, we're starting to collaborate with our clients because this is going to require bringing together different skills and expertise. I'm seeing it in particular industries like steel and chemicals, where competitors previously fought tooth and nail from a commercial and competitive perspective are now coming together because this is a problem for all of us. We're not necessarily trying to, to make loads of money. We were trying to, and yes, there's lots of value to be achieved on the low carbon agenda. But first and foremost, we need to get to net zero. And, I've made a comment and a statement earlier. We will not get to net zero without innovation. I'm going to make a second one. We will not get there without collaboration. The challenge is too big. Nobody, and I would say I'm meant to be a global leader, nobody has got all of the information, all of the skills and the expertise. So I think it's happening, number one. And number two, I actually think in my own role in KPMG, and I would say this to any other organization, please collaborate. It is the way of the future. And I want to bring it back, if I could, so to within the organization. I grew up in a accounting organization where you had partners, directors, managers, and juniors. In some ways on this agenda, that sort of hierarchy is gone. What I'm now finding, what I'm loving, is that we are bringing together people who come with different perspectives, different knowledge, and working together. The old norms are going out the door. We are, while I'm very optimistic, I recognize we're facing a crisis, and that's why there is a different way to get things done, and it is starting to happen.
So the lion will lie down with the lamb, huh? You're promising a great peace and harmony across the industries. So I hope that you are right, that you are the optimist and I am the cynic here.
Time will tell, but bear in mind, in time, one of my passions in life is always history. Look back at times of great global crisis, whether it's world wars, pandemics, various other events. People did things differently. Two things happened. One, innovation takes off like you've never seen before, and we are seeing that on the climate agenda. And secondly, people come together because, let's stop joking about this. This is not 10, 15, 20 years away. This is in front of our doorstep. And it's, we've seen lots of events during 2020 and 2021. We're going to see more of those. This is becoming very immediate, which is why these type of new responses are required.
Okay, well, yeah, hopefully time will tell. And I really hope that if I place this bet, then I will lose this one. So I'm hoping to be optimistic here. So you talk about reskilling, and that was another thing that really stood out in the report, is just how optimistic a lot of the respondees were in terms of the skills. They felt that, yes, there may be some reskilling, but they were by golly, ready to handle it. And a couple of perhaps cynical questions that came up when I was reading that is, do they even know what the skills are? I mean, if you don't have a decarbonization plan in place, how do you know if you have the skills in place? So, and you expressed a little bit of skepticism yourself about that. So I'm curious, what do you think about the skills, and where do you think the biggest skill gaps are?
Yep. So I am skeptical about what we received back in terms of responses to our global survey in the report, which is over 1,000 organizations across all sectors and all geographies. I know the reality. The reality, and it shouldn't be a surprise to anybody, is we have nowhere near enough people with the skills right across the decarbonisation agenda. And I'll come back to the specific gaps in a second. That shouldn't come as a surprise, though, because 24, maybe 30, 36 months ago, we weren't talking about these issues. Mm-hmm. Yes, we were talking about climate in a broad sense. We were not talking about the type of defined pathways to net zero that we're asking organizations to undertake today. So this is new. It's not as if there's, hundreds of thousands of university graduates that have been trained up in this. I see it in KPMG, and I know other organizations who are trying to tackle the climate agenda. we're going out and we're looking to find people who have the expertise and the experience to help us. And they are thin on the ground. And that is a reality. And we need to face up to this. And again, it's one of the reasons why I wanted to put this report into the public domain, because sooner we recognize this, the better. And for me, one of the messages that I wanted to get out, and particularly on this event today on LinkedIn, is we need to look and work with educational institutions and establishments around the world. The climate question needs now to become upfront with medicine, law, accounting, and some of the other so-called prestigious degree courses, because it is fundamentally important. There is no doubt in my mind that demand will be there, and we just don't have enough trained people in the industry today. So we are looking to the educational world to provide us with the supply of graduate talent. I don't really care anymore what age they are. What I want are people who are passionate and who believe in this agenda and who come and it can help us with some of the skills. You asked about where are the gaps. I mean, you name it. That we need. Organizations need people with skills in areas like climate risk, in areas like energy efficiency, to understand how to procure renewable energy. People who understand the carbon markets. How to price carbon, how to figure out how to buy and procure carbon offsets. I mean, it is a vast agenda. And that's even before we get into real deep expertise around supply chains. So in organizations, it is not enough to decarbonize your own business. If you want to achieve a proper net zero objective, you need to decarbonize your supply chain. That sometimes involves working with your suppliers to get them and their suppliers to change the way they produce goods and services for you. Imagine in a heavy goods industry going back to your supply chain and saying, I don't want you using that type of steel anymore. I want you to use a green steel alternative. And yes, and here's one of the real challenges. It will cost a little bit more today because we haven't got the price of it down sufficiently yet. But that is part of the issue. There is a cost part of this as well, which we cannot ignore, which does make it more difficult to achieve our objectives.
And the ethical supply chain is so interesting because it used to be that I think consumers in particular were more accepting of, I will trust what you say about your end product. But now it's a no. I want you to give me some assurance that if you go all the way back to the beginning, that every single step in the supply chain is something that I can believe in. Again, back to the increasing expectations of the public as a whole, which is interesting. That it does seem that some companies, at least in my experience, are saying, wait a second, I thought I was doing really well. I thought I was doing maybe best in class, but the definition of what's best in class keeps changing. I mean, I do think in the words of the immortal Janet Jackson, what have you done for me lately? And seeing, companies have to address that. It's not just about what's right in front of you, have a much bigger picture.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with all that. And part of the problem here, and I get this from corporate executives all over the world, is to say, there's just so much to take on board with this agenda. We've spoken in this session about the people agenda. There is a vast reporting agenda. The demands that are coming on corporates to deal with this whole area are absolutely phenomenal. And there is an increasing expectation that the data and the information you produce to your shareholders stands up to scrutiny. And that is still one of the biggest challenges, because unless corporations are seen to be delivering data that has integrity and that can be validated and verified, it is going to undermine the entire agenda. It is the data and the reporting bit of this are phenomenally important.
Absolutely. Something else that was interesting in the report is that, speaking of challenges, it talked about pushback. And a lot of the companies who responded said they expect pushback. Where do you think the biggest pushback is going to come? Will it come from within the organizations? Will it come from particular areas? Or where do you expect, if we're trying to really look at the change management journey for this particular change, what should we be the most concerned about for individuals or groups?
I'll give you one very specific example, though, because it's often good just to narrow it down a little bit. I did a webinar for the oil and gas industry, and I spoke about the challenges. I spoke about the transition to a newer, cleaner energy future. And one of the participants sent me a message and said, what about me? This was a guy who was a geologist, worked in geology for oil and gas. He said, I get the climate agenda. We have to do it. But the reality is, I'm not going to, at my age, I'm not going to be retrained. I'm going to be left behind. That one episode left a huge imprint on me. this is the part of the problem. It's very easy for, somebody like me to be passionate and advocate for climate action, but we have to think about the wider impact we're having. So there will be, in the first instance, there will unfortunately be employees that are left behind. That's why, any climate policy needs to be considered as part of a wider ESG discussion, and particularly around the social issues. That's within an organization. I want you to think and reflect for a second, Zoe, on communities. I grew up as a kid in Northwestern Europe when we were closing coal mines in the UK in the 1980s. I mean, the social turmoil that caused in communities was absolutely phenomenal. And I would say it's taken 20 or 30 years since then for the pain that transition, it wasn't climate, it was caused by just the economic reality at the time. But we are potentially going to face into that type of not just industrial unrest, but societal unrest. We saw the yellow shirts movement in France and the reaction to increased fuel prices. I spoke about the fact that some of these decarbonization solutions will push up prices, and inflation is a very hot topic. So there is a vast mix of societal pressures within organizations and in communities that potentially are going to erupt. And that's why we cannot adopt a narrow, dogmatic perspective on climate where, we say full steam ahead, decarbonize, reduce your carbon emissions. I am not interested in any climate discussion that doesn't take into account people and communities. We will fail if we don't do that.
And so who bears that burden? I mean, that's a great point. And I think if you were to ask any company, any organization, do you hate the people who buy your product? Do you hate the communities where they work? They'd say absolutely not. Of course, I love everybody. At the end of the day, though, are they beholden to the communities or are they beholden to their shareholders? I mean, who ultimately is responsible for that broader social impact? Who bears the brunt of it? Who bears the responsibility? And who ultimately will benefit from it?
Yeah, thank you for that incredibly tough question as we get towards the end. So
you said you wanted provocative, Mike, so I'm giving you provocative.
So here's my response. I don't know. If I had all the answers today, I wouldn't be here. We'd be implementing solutions. I don't have the answer to that question. But I am incredibly concerned about the impact of the cost of decarbonization and the impact that's going to, the whole issue of decarbonization strategy is going to have on communities. Ultimately, I'm against the idea of always looking to governments. Governments, are not always going to be the solution. This is going to have to be a shared burden. Corporations are going to have to pick up some of this, and ultimately, we as individuals will have to recognize the reality, because this is going to affect our lives. It's certainly going to affect our children's lives, which is why, we can't walk away from the burden. However, I come back to one point, and I know it's going a little bit off topic, but innovation. I am a true believer that we are only scratching the surface around the potential of innovation. If we can get the innovation agenda working in the way that it should be working, and in the US, John Kerry has announced an absolutely fabulous initiative called the First Movers Coalition, where he's trying to get the big corporates to start embracing the new innovative solutions that are emerging. The more we think and embrace innovation and make it mainstream across the climate agenda, that's going to help reduce the costs. It's going to help us to decarbonize. And actually, ultimately, it will take away some of the pain. I'm sure, you're probably not as old as I am, but you remember when we started talking about digital, first of all, in a world where we didn't all have a laptop on our desk. And when I started working, I wasn't getting 200 emails a day. I was getting faxes and telexes and things like that. We've gone through fundamental changes before. Yes, we've been frightened, but we don't have the luxury for any of that. We need to embrace it, and we need to fight on all fronts, which is why I spoke 2 minutes ago about innovation, people together with the capital and the policy part all need to go together.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. And the digital revolution is a really good parallel, because I think most of us can relate to it, that it used to be e-commerce. And then it was just commerce. I mean, that's just business. We don't talk about the difference because it became integrated. So I'm curious, though, I think whenever you're talking about ESG and all the different components, especially looking at the S, which you touched on with the impact of communities, but it's obviously true for the E as well. What about impact? Because it is really easy to get caught up in the noise, and it is easy to focus on the activity and everything people are doing without focusing on, is it really going to matter? And at the end of the day, I think that is the most cynical question is, will any of this actually matter? Will any of this make a difference? And how do we help organizations focus on that? So it's focusing on the outcomes, not just the activity, to make sure we're not wasting time. Because as you've mentioned, we have precious little of it. So we need to make the most of what we've got. So how do we do that? How do we focus on the right questions and not on the wrong activities?
Measurement, reporting, data, and assurance. 4 words. They are all incredibly important. And I referenced earlier, Zoe, the importance of producing good information to stakeholders, because without that, this entire agenda will fail.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen, and you've been very much involved in this, we've seen across the wider ESG agenda the matrix of different reporting solutions, which frankly has made somebody like me a little bit pessimistic about the wider ESG agenda, because what's my benchmark? What is the correct reporting standard? On the climate agenda, we're actually trying to change that. We're trying to reduce the type of reporting we do to make sure that it's standardized across organizations and across geographies, because that's, it might sound very simplistic, but ultimately, this is about reporting, telling people what we do, not just in terms of financial terms, but also, I think, a narrative explaining the impact. And over time, I'm hoping that the more we standardize the way we measure and report, that hopefully this so-called issue of greenwashing, I'm not even sure it's the right word anymore, goes away.
Yeah, I think the topic of greenwashing is an interesting one. And you and I have discussed that before, that greenwashing does imply a certain level of deceit. The idea is that I'm trying to make what I am doing look a lot better than it is. I mean, do you actually think that greenwashing is happening, or do you think it's just a question of people's actions not catching up with their intent?
Yeah, I think the word is overused and probably a little bit abused. I mean, because it seems to suggest deliberate or fraudulent action. That's not really the reality, even though I know there are cases of that. The more real situation is back to what I said about measurement and reporting. It's the difficulties of collecting the actual data, particularly if you need to get data from your suppliers. It's the difficulties of actually measuring that data in a consistent way. Because if I measure it one way and somebody else measures it a different way, it doesn't mean we're greenwashing. It just means we're using different standards and different methodologies to report the information. So the sooner we get to consistency on reporting, the better. And again, I referenced the importance of historical analogies. The world of financial accounting used to be like this, over 100 years ago. And it was only when we started introducing, accounting standards that all stakeholders brought into. We need the same type of approach on the climate agenda. We need standardization of reporting, standardization of measurement, that people count carbon the same way. That's ultimately what it's about. I think that will hopefully eliminate, not all, but certainly a big part of the difficulty.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Well, I think with that, actually, we are close to time. So, Mike, as always, great to talk with you. Thank you for an engaging, interesting, and provocative discussion. So hopefully everybody's had a chance to read the report, but if not, I'm sure they will be doing it now. A lot of good insight in there. Any closing thoughts or final words?
No, I mean, thank you, Zoe. Great discussion, and I think you've helped to sort of help me to bring out some of my really sort of deep thoughts around innovation, around people, human capital. We've a long way to go on this agenda, but at least now we're talking about the real issues. So it's been great to be here this afternoon.
Absolutely. Thank you. Have a great evening, and everybody have a great afternoon or great morning, wherever the case may be. And looking forward to talking with you again on another one of our series.